There is a moment in the Invincible comics, somewhere around issue 65, where an old Viltrumite with one arm and a face that looks like it was carved from granite stands over a young man who is barely breathing. The young man is Mark Grayson. He is lying in a crater of his own making, bones broken, blood pooling beneath him, and for a brief second, you might think this is the climax of the fight. But the old Viltrumite does not celebrate. He does not gloat. He simply stands there, disappointed, the way a foreman might look at a wall that was not built to code. That small detail, that flicker of professional dissatisfaction in the middle of extraordinary carnage, changes everything about what this character means. His name is Conquest, and the philosophy he carries with him is older and more terrifying than any superpower. Think about that for a moment. A being who has lived for roughly 5,000 years, who has personally overseen the subjugation of entire civilizations, who lost his arm to creatures called Rognars on a planet so hostile it earned the name the Savage Planet, and whose response to nearly killing a young superhero is not triumph but mild irritation. That is not the behavior of a villain. That is the behavior of a functionary. And the difference between those two things is what makes Conquest one of the most philosophically rich characters in all of comic book fiction. If you are enjoying this kind of deep dive into the world of Invincible, take a second to subscribe. It is free, and it helps us keep making these long videos for you to fall asleep to or just think along with. To understand what Conquest represents, you first have to understand the civilization that created him. The Viltrum Empire is not simply a collection of powerful beings who decided to take over the galaxy. It is an ideology made flesh. Every Viltrumite carries within them a specific philosophical framework. A worldview that has been refined over thousands of years of war, expansion, and something called the Great Purge. And that worldview can be reduced to a single, elegant, and deeply disturbing proposition. Strength is the only virtue. Not courage, not wisdom, not compassion, not creativity. Strength. Raw, measurable physical superiority. In the Viltrumite moral universe, if you are strong enough to take something, you deserve it. If you are too weak to hold on to it, you never deserved it in the first place. This is not a new idea, of course. Philosophers have been wrestling with variations of it for thousands of years. But the Viltrumites are interesting because they do not just believe it. They built an entire galactic empire on it. They organized their government around it. They raised their children according to it. And when internal divisions arose, when some Viltrumites began to question whether strength alone was sufficient justification for everything they had done, the empire responded with the Great Purge. The Great Purge is one of the most important events in Invincible lore, and it is worth taking a moment to sit with what it actually means. After the death of Emperor Argal, the Viltrumite homeworld was thrown into chaos. The newly appointed Grand Regent, Thrag, decided that the instability was not a political problem. It was a genetic one. Weakness had crept into the population. Doubt had infected the species, and the only cure was elimination. What followed was a civil war that lasted centuries. When it was over, roughly half the Viltrumite population was dead. Not conquered, not exiled, dead. Killed by their own kind. The survivors were the strongest, the most ruthless, the most committed to the ideology of strength. They had proven their worth in the most literal way possible. They had survived. Now imagine growing up in that world. Imagine being a child on Viltrum after the Purge, knowing that every adult around you earned their right to exist by killing someone who was not strong enough. Imagine what that does to your understanding of love, of friendship, of trust. Every relationship becomes a potential test. Every interaction carries the implicit question of whether you are strong enough to justify your continued existence. This is the world that made Conquest. And this is why when he stands over a broken Mark Grayson with nothing but professional disappointment on his face, it tells you everything you need to know about what the Viltrumite philosophy does to a person over 5,000 years. But the Purge also did something more subtle, something that takes time to appreciate. It did not just kill half the population. It killed the half that might have had doubts. The questioners, the ones who hesitated, the ones who looked at a fellow Viltrumite and thought, maybe we do not need to do this. Maybe there is another way. Those Viltrumites are gone. What remained was a species that had been genetically and culturally filtered for absolute certainty. Every surviving Viltrumite carried within them the implicit knowledge that they existed because someone else did not, that their life was purchased with another's death. And rather than experiencing this as guilt or trauma, they were taught to experience it as validation. You are alive because you deserve to be. You deserve to be because you are strong. You are strong because you are alive. It is a tautology dressed up as a philosophy, a circle that looks like a straight line if you never step back far enough to see its shape. Conquest was born during the reign of Emperor Argal, which means he is old enough to remember what the Empire was like before the Purge. He lived through the upheaval. He survived the centuries of civil war. He watched half his species die, and then he kept going. He kept doing what the Empire asked of him, which was, in essence, the same thing it had always asked. Go to this planet, make them submit. If they resist, break them harder. If they still resist after that, there is no after that. Nobody resists conquest. That is not a boast. It is a job description. There is something worth pausing on here, which is the sheer scale of time involved. 5,000 years. When you encounter a number like that in a comic book, it is easy to let it wash over you. 5,000 years, sure, that is a long time, but it is a fictional long time, so maybe it does not need to be taken literally. But take it literally for a moment. 5,000 years ago, in our world, the Great Pyramid of Giza was being built. Writing had just been invented. Horses had recently been domesticated. The Bronze Age was in its early stages. Everything that you think of as human civilization, every empire, every religion, every philosophical system, every war, every work of art, every scientific discovery, all of it happened within the last 5,000 years. Conquest has been alive for all of it. If he had been born on Earth, he would have watched the rise and fall of Sumer, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Mongol Empire, the British Empire, and everything that came after. He would have been ancient when Christ was born. He would have been ancient when Homer composed the Iliad. He would have been ancient when the first cities were built on the plains of Mesopotamia. And for all of that time, he has done one thing: conquered. Not learned, not explored, not created. Conquered. The monotony of that should horrify you. The weight of it. The crushing, suffocating sameness of 5 millennia spent doing essentially the same thing on planet after planet after planet. Imagine the most repetitive job you have ever had. Now imagine doing it every day for 5,000 years. Now imagine that the job involves destroying civilizations. That is Conquest's life, and the fact that he does not seem to find it repetitive, that he approaches each new assignment with the same professional focus, is not a sign of dedication. It is a sign that something inside him died a very long time ago. Something that would have recognized the repetition. Something that would have asked, is this really all there is? This is where the character becomes genuinely fascinating from a philosophical standpoint. There is a concept in political philosophy called the banality of evil, coined by the philosopher Hannah Arendt when she was covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1962. Eichmann was one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, responsible for the logistics of transporting millions of people to concentration camps. But when Arendt saw him in the courtroom, she did not see a monster. She saw a bureaucrat, a man who spoke in cliches, who deferred to authority, who seemed incapable of thinking for himself. He had not committed his crimes out of hatred or even ideology in any passionate sense. He had committed them because they were his job, because that was what was expected of him, because the system he operated within had made the unthinkable routine. Conquest is the Viltrumite version of this. He is not a villain who relishes evil for its own sake, though he does enjoy violence. And that distinction matters, and we will come back to it. He is an enforcer, a professional. He has been doing this for so long that the act of subjugating entire civilizations has become as mundane to him as filling out paperwork. When he arrives on a planet, he does not make speeches about Viltrumite. He does not explain his philosophy. He simply begins, "The violence is not the point. The violence is the method. The point is compliance. The point is the continuation of the empire. The point is the job." And yet there is something else going on beneath the surface, something that complicates this reading in important ways. Because unlike Eichmann, Conquest is not a man who lacks the capacity for independent thought. He is a being of extraordinary intelligence and experience who has chosen, over the course of 5 millennia, to remain within the system that shaped him. He knows what he is. He has had 5,000 years to reflect on it. And his conclusion, the conclusion that the comics and the animated series both hint at, is that this is simply what he is good at. This is where he finds meaning, not in the Empire's ideology per se, but in the act of conquest itself, in the physicality of it, in the struggle, in the moment when resistance finally breaks. Now here is where that distinction about enjoyment becomes important. Conquest enjoys violence. The comics make this clear. He takes pleasure in the physical act of combat, but his enjoyment is not the sadistic glee of a torturer who delights in suffering. It is something closer to the satisfaction an athlete feels in the middle of a perfect performance. When everything clicks, when the body moves exactly as it should, when the opponent's weaknesses reveal themselves and the strategy unfolds like a proof. Conquest enjoys violence the way a master craftsman enjoys their craft, not because of the damage it causes, but because of the skill it requires. This is a subtle but critically important distinction, because it tells you that Conquest is not a psychopath in the clinical sense. A psychopath would enjoy the suffering of others. Conquest barely notices it. What he enjoys is the doing, the act. The execution, the suffering is incidental. It is not the product he is creating. It is the sawdust on the workshop floor. This makes him more frightening, not less, because a being who inflicts suffering as a byproduct of something they genuinely enjoy is far harder to stop than one who inflicts suffering as a goal. You can deny a sadist their pleasure by refusing to scream. You cannot deny Conquest his satisfaction by refusing to break, because your breaking is not what satisfies him. The fight itself satisfies him. The contest, the application of 5,000 years of refined technique against whatever resistance a planet can muster. Your suffering is irrelevant to his experience. You are not even a person to him. You are a problem set, a challenge to be met and overcome. And that total erasure of your personhood, that reduction of a living being to a variable in an equation, is the most violent thing Conquest does. Not the punches, not the broken bones, not the destroyed cities, the refusal to see you as anything other than an obstacle. This is what makes him different from Omni-Man, and that difference is crucial for understanding both characters. Nolan, Omni-Man, was sent to Earth with essentially the same mission Conquest has carried out on countless worlds. Weaken the planet's defenses, prepare it for Viltrumite colonization. But Nolan did something Conquest never does. He hesitated. He formed attachments, he fell in love with a human woman, had a son, built a life that gradually became more real to him than the mission he was supposed to be carrying out. When the time came to choose between his duty and his family, Nolan chose his family. It nearly destroyed him. It took years of exile and soul-searching. But eventually, Nolan rejected the Viltrumite philosophy. He decided that strength was not the only virtue, that love mattered, that his son mattered more than the Empire. Conquest would never make that choice. Not because he is incapable of love, though the comics suggest his capacity for it has atrophied to the point of near extinction. But because the choice itself would not make sense to him, the framework within which such a choice would be meaningful does not exist in his mind. When Nolan looks at his son, he sees a person. When Conquest looks at Mark Grayson, he sees a test subject, a measure of Viltrumite genetic viability. A problem to be solved through the application of sufficient force. The emotional dimension that makes Nolan's story so compelling is simply absent from Conquest's experience, and that absence is itself the most damning indictment of the Viltrumite philosophy the series ever offers. There is a thought experiment that makes this clearer. Imagine that the Empire had sent Conquest to Earth instead of Nolan. Imagine that Conquest, not Omni-Man, had been assigned to weaken humanity's defenses from the inside. What would that look like? The answer, almost certainly, is that it would not look like anything, because Conquest would not have been able to do it. Not because the mission requires something he does not have. It requires the ability to pretend, to wear a mask, to live among humans and behave as one of them for years, possibly decades, before revealing your true purpose. And pretending requires a kind of emotional intelligence, a kind of psychological flexibility that Conquest simply does not possess. He cannot pretend to be weak because he has never understood weakness from the inside. He cannot pretend to love because he has no reference point for what love looks like in practice, in the small daily gestures, in the patience and compromise and vulnerability that sustain a real relationship over years. He cannot infiltrate a society because infiltration requires the ability to see the world through someone else's eyes, and Conquest has looked through no eyes but his own for 5,000 years. Nolan could do it because Nolan, despite his Viltrumite conditioning, retained some capacity for empathy, some ability to see humans as beings rather than objects, some residual spark of the emotional complexity that the Viltrumite philosophy tried to extinguish. And that spark, ironically, is what made Nolan both a better agent and a worse one. Better because he could actually carry out the infiltration mission. Worse because the same capacity for empathy that allowed him to live among humans eventually caused him to love them. The very quality that made him useful to the Empire was the quality that ultimately turned him against it. There is a lesson in that about the dangers of deploying tools you do not fully understand. To put it another way, Nolan and Conquest represent two possible outcomes of the same starting conditions. Both were born Viltrumite, both were raised in the same culture, both were sent to conquer planets, but Nolan was exposed to something Conquest never was, or never allowed himself to be: intimacy. Real, sustained, daily intimacy with beings who are weaker than him. Debbie Grayson is, by Viltrumite standards, unimaginably fragile. She could be killed by a careless gesture. She ages, she gets sick, she will die within the span of time that a Viltrumite considers a brief nap. And yet Nolan loved her. not despite her weakness, but in a way that made the concept of weakness irrelevant. He loved her as a person, and personhood does not have a power level. Conquest has never had a Debbie, has never allowed the possibility of a Debbie. The closest thing to sustained intimacy in his life is the relationship between a hammer and a nail, and even that metaphor gives him too much credit, because a hammer at least rests between strikes. Conquest does not rest. He moves from assignment to assignment, planet to planet, century to century, with no pause long enough for anything unexpected to take root. No gap in the schedule where something like love or friendship or even simple familiarity might slip in and disrupt the pattern. He is a closed system, and closed systems, as any physicist will tell you, tend toward entropy, toward disorder, toward heat death, toward the slow, irreversible dissipation of everything that makes a system interesting or productive or alive. Think about what it means to live for 5,000 years and have no relationships that are not defined by power, no friendships that are not alliances of convenience, no love that is not contingent on usefulness. The other Viltrumites fear Conquest. They avoid him. They consider him unstable, which is ironic because Conquest is arguably the most stable Viltrumite of all. He is the one who never wavered. He never questioned. He never had a crisis of faith. He took the philosophy of strength to its logical conclusion and lived it with absolute consistency for 5 millennia. And the result is a being of profound, echoing loneliness. A being who is, in the most literal sense, alone in the universe. Not because no one else exists, but because the only way he knows how to relate to other beings is through violence. There is a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche who wrote extensively about what he called master morality and slave morality. These are not moral judgments in the traditional sense. They are descriptions of two fundamentally different ways of creating values. Master morality, according to Nietzsche, is the morality of the strong, the noble, the powerful. It defines good as that which is strong, proud, and life-affirming, and bad as that which is weak, timid, and life-denying. Slave morality, by contrast, is the morality of the oppressed. It defines good as that which is humble, compassionate, and self-sacrificing, and evil as that which is cruel, selfish, and dominating. Nietzsche argued that most of Western morality is slave morality, a system of values created by the weak to constrain the strong, to make strength itself seem like a moral failing. The Viltrumites, on the surface, seem like a perfect embodiment of Nietzsche's master morality. They define good as strength. They despise weakness. They see their conquest of other civilizations not as oppression, but as a natural expression of their superiority. They are, in their own minds, the noble class of the universe, and everyone else exists to serve them or be destroyed. But here is where it gets interesting. Nietzsche did not actually advocate for master morality. He described it. He analyzed it. And he argued that the truly great individual, the one he called the Übermensch, would transcend both master and slave morality. The Übermensch would create their own values, not inherited from either tradition. They would be strong, yes, but their strength would be in service of something greater than mere domination. It would be creative strength, generative strength, the strength to build something new rather than simply destroy what exists. By this measure, the Viltrumites are not Nietzschean supermen at all. They are stuck in the most primitive form of master morality, the form that Nietzsche himself would have recognized as a dead end. Their strength creates nothing. It only maintains a system of domination that has existed for thousands of years, without evolving, without growing, without producing anything of genuine value. And Conquest is the purest expression of this stagnation. He is 5,000 years old and he has not changed, not in any meaningful way. He is the same being he was when the Great Purge ended. A weapon, a tool, an instrument of policy, the most powerful being you could possibly be, while still being, in some fundamental sense, nothing at all. It is worth noting that Nietzsche himself was acutely aware of how easily his ideas could be misused. He wrote about the will to power, but he did not mean merely the will to dominate others. He meant the will to overcome yourself, the will to grow, the will to become more than you currently are. The Viltrumites have taken this concept and stripped it of everything that makes it interesting. They have reduced the will to power to the will to punch harder. They have taken Nietzsche's most nuanced and challenging idea and turned it into a bumper sticker. And Conquest is walking around wearing that bumper sticker on his chest, completely unaware that the philosopher whose ideas he inadvertently embodies would have found him not inspiring but pitiable. Nietzsche would have looked at Conquest and seen not a Superman but a failed experiment. A being who had all the raw material for greatness and used it to build nothing more imaginative than a very efficient fist. Nietzsche also wrote about what he called eternal recurrence, a thought experiment in which you imagine that your life, exactly as you have lived it, will repeat infinitely. Every joy, every sorrow, every mundane Tuesday afternoon, over and over, forever. Nietzsche proposed this as the ultimate test of a life well lived. If you could embrace the idea of living your exact life again, infinitely, you had achieved something like genuine fulfillment. If the thought filled you with horror, you had some thinking to do about how you were spending your time. Apply this to Conquest. 5,000 years of the same pattern, repeated on planet after planet. If you told Conquest that he would live his life again, identically from the beginning, would he embrace it? The terrifying answer might be yes. Not because his life is fulfilling in any meaningful sense, but because he has lost the capacity to imagine an alternative. He does not know what he is missing. The thought experiment fails because it requires a baseline of self-awareness that Conquest no longer possesses. He would choose the same life again because it is the only life he can conceive of. And that inability to conceive of alternatives is itself the most damning evidence of what the Viltrumite philosophy does to a mind over sufficient time. This is where the comparison to historical conquerors becomes illuminating. Think about Alexander the Great. Alexander conquered most of the known world by the time he was 30. He was a military genius, ruthless in battle, capable of extraordinary cruelty when he deemed it necessary. But Alexander was also a student of Aristotle. He carried copies of Homer's Iliad with him on campaign. He founded cities. He attempted, however imperfectly, to blend Greek and Persian cultures into something new. His conquests were driven by ambition, certainly, and by a belief in his own divine destiny. But they were also driven by curiosity, by a genuine desire to see what was over the next horizon, by something that, for all its destructive consequences, was recognizably human. Alexander wept when he ran out of worlds to conquer. That story may be apocryphal, but the sentiment it captures is real. Alexander wanted more. Not just more territory, but more experience. More knowledge, more of whatever lay beyond the edge of the known map. His desire to conquer was entangled with a desire to discover. And that entanglement, however problematic, made him a fundamentally different kind of conqueror than Conquest. Alexander was driven by hunger. Conquest is driven by function. Alexander wanted to see the other side of the mountain. Conquest wants to flatten the mountain, because that is what the work order says. Now think about Genghis Khan. The Mongol conquests were among the most devastating in human history. Entire civilizations were destroyed, populations were decimated. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The scale of death was staggering, nearly incomprehensible. And yet the Mongol Empire also established the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and stability across Eurasia that facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and technological transfer on an unprecedented scale. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. Ideas and inventions moved between East and West more freely than they ever had before. The destruction was real and terrible, but it was followed by creation, by something new, by the kind of unexpected synthesis that only happens when different cultures are forced into contact with each other. The Mongol example is particularly instructive because it shows how even the most brutal forms of conquest can, paradoxically, create conditions for growth. Not intentionally. Genghis Khan did not set out to facilitate cultural exchange. He set out to conquer the world. But the empire he built, precisely because it connected such vast and diverse territories, became a conduit for the very things that the Viltrumite Empire systematically suppresses. New ideas, new perspectives, new possibilities. The Mongols conquered, but they also absorbed. They took from the civilizations they subdued. They incorporated Persian administrative techniques, Chinese engineering, Arabic mathematics. They were not too proud to learn from the people they had defeated, and that willingness to learn, that openness to the other, is what made the Mongol Empire, for all its violence, a generative force in human history. Conquest creates nothing. That is the fundamental difference. Alexander dreamed of a unified world. Genghis Khan, however unintentionally, created conditions for a new kind of global connectivity. Even the most brutal human conquerors left something behind besides rubble. But Conquest, and the Viltrumite Empire he serves, produces only compliance. They do not bring culture to the worlds they subjugate. They do not share knowledge. They do not build. They simply arrive, demand submission, and enforce it with violence. The planets they conquer are not improved. They are pacified. There is a vast and important difference between those two things, and the difference reveals the core emptiness of the Viltrumite project. Pacification is not progress. Silence is not peace. And a planet that submits out of terror is not a planet that has been integrated into anything meaningful. It is a planet that has been broken, and broken things do not produce value. They just sit there, shattered and compliant, waiting for the next demand. This points to something deeply uncomfortable about the Viltrumite philosophy, something that the Invincible comics explore with remarkable nuance over their 144-issue run. The philosophy of strength as the only virtue is ultimately self-defeating. It produces beings of extraordinary power who have nothing meaningful to do with that power. It creates an empire that spans the galaxy but has no purpose beyond its own continuation. It generates warriors like Conquest who are 5,000 years old and have accumulated nothing but scars, a cybernetic arm, and a reputation that makes even their own people flinch. The Viltrumite ideal, followed to its logical conclusion, produces emptiness. Magnificent, terrifying, galaxy-spanning emptiness. There is an economic concept that applies here, though it might seem like an unlikely connection. It is called the resource curse. Countries that are rich in a single natural resources, oil, diamonds, gold, often end up worse off than countries with fewer resources. The wealth from that one resource distorts the economy, discourages investment in other sectors, funds corruption, and creates a kind of dependency that makes the country vulnerable to any fluctuation in the value of its primary asset. The resource is both the source of the country's power and the cause of its stagnation. The Viltrumites suffer from a resource curse of the body. Their resource is physical strength, and it is so overwhelming, so dominant, so utterly superior to anything the rest of the galaxy possesses, that they never bothered to develop anything else. Why build culture when you can just take someone else's? Why develop philosophy when the only philosophy you need is the one that says the strong deserve to rule? Why invest in creativity when destruction is so much more efficient? Their strength is their oil. And like oil-rich nations that never diversify, they have built an entire civilization on a single, depletable asset. Depletable not because Viltrumites grow weaker over time, they do not, but because a civilization that values nothing but strength eventually exhausts the meaning that strength can provide. You can only conquer so many planets before the act becomes meaningless. You can only break so many civilizations before the breaking becomes indistinguishable from the previous breaking. And then what? Then you are Conquest, 5,000 years old, with nothing to show for it but a cybernetic arm and the fear of your peers. And this brings us to what might be the most important philosophical question the character of Conquest raises. What happens to a being whose only purpose is destruction when there is nothing left to destroy? What does Conquest do between missions? What does he think about when he is not breaking planets? The comics do not spend much time on this question, but the silence itself is telling. There is no evidence that Conquest has hobbies, no suggestion of intellectual interests or artistic inclinations. No indication that he has ever, in 5,000 years, wanted to do anything other than what the Empire tells him to do. He is, in existentialist terms, a being who has surrendered his freedom entirely. He has allowed the Empire to define him so completely that without it, he would be nothing. Not nothing in a metaphorical sense. Nothing in an ontological sense. Without the mission, without the violence, without the next planet to break, Conquest does not exist. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, argued that human beings are condemned to be free. We are thrown into existence without a predetermined essence, without a built-in purpose, and we must create meaning for ourselves through our choices and actions. This is terrifying, Sartre acknowledged. The weight of absolute freedom is almost unbearable. And so most people flee from it. They adopt roles. They follow rules. They let society, religion, culture, family tell them who they are and what they should value. Sartre called this bad faith, the act of pretending that you have no choice, that your identity is fixed, that the way things are is the way they must be. Conquest is a masterpiece of bad faith. He has had 5,000 years of freedom, 5,000 years in which he could have chosen differently, and he has spent every single one of those years doing exactly what the Empire expected of him. Not because he was forced, not because he had no alternative, but because the alternative, the possibility of defining himself outside the framework of violence and domination, was too frightening to contemplate. It is easier to be a weapon than a person. Weapons do not have to make choices. Weapons do not have to find meaning. Weapons just do what they were built to do. And Conquest, over the course of millennia, has built himself into the most efficient weapon the Viltrumite Empire has ever produced. The cost of that efficiency is his humanity, or whatever the Viltrumite equivalent of humanity might be. Consider how this applies to the specific circumstances of Conquest's existence. Every century, he is given a new assignment, a new civilization that has the audacity to resist Viltrumite rule. And every century, he has a choice. He could refuse, he could simply stop, he could fly to the farthest reaches of the galaxy and disappear. He has the power. No Viltrumite could stop him if he truly wanted to leave. The Grand Regent might send enforcers, but Conquest is the enforcer. He is the one they send when enforcement is needed. There is no one to send after Conquest. And yet he stays. He obeys. He accepts the next assignment and the next and the next, not because he must, but because the alternative is an abyss of undefined freedom that terrifies him more than any enemy he has ever faced. It is possible, even likely, that Conquest has never consciously articulated this fear, that he has never sat down and thought, I continue serving the Empire because the alternative is existential vertigo. The fear operates below the level of conscious awareness. It is the water he swims in, the gravity he has never thought to question. And that unconscious, unexamined terror of freedom is the chain that binds him more securely than any physical restraint ever could. You do not need to chain a prisoner who does not know the door is open. There is another dimension to Conquest's bad faith that connects to the broader question of how civilizations maintain themselves. Every empire needs enforcers who believe in the cause, or at least behave as though they do. Every system of power relies on individuals who will carry out its directives without questioning whether those directives are justified. And the most effective enforcers are not the ones who are forced to comply. They are the ones who have internalized the system's values so completely that compliance feels like choice. Conquest does not obey the Empire because the Empire compels him. He obeys because he has made the Empire's values his own. The chain of command runs through his nervous system. The hierarchy is written into his sense of self. He is not a reluctant servant. He is a true believer, or rather, he is something even more useful to the Empire than a true believer. He is a being for whom the question of belief does not arise. He does not believe in the Viltrumite philosophy the way a person believes in a religion or a political ideology. He enacts it the way a planet enacts gravity, automatically, without reflection, without the possibility of choosing otherwise. There is a related concept in psychology, one that does not require 5,000 years to manifest. It is called identity foreclosure, and it describes what happens when a person commits to an identity, a role, a way of being, without ever exploring alternatives. A child who is told from birth that they will be a soldier, and who becomes a soldier without ever questioning whether they might want to be something else, has experienced identity foreclosure. They may be a perfectly competent soldier, they may even enjoy the work, but they have never confronted the question of whether this is really who they are or merely who they were told to be. They have closed the door on possibility before ever opening it. Conquest is the ultimate case of identity foreclosure. 5,000 years of being the Empire's enforcer without a single recorded instance of questioning whether there might be another path. Not a moment of doubt. Not a season of uncertainty. Not even the kind of vague, unfocused restlessness that sometimes precedes a genuine change of direction. Just 5 millennia of the same identity, reinforced by every successful mission, every broken planet, every fearful glance from a fellow Viltrumite. He is the enforcer. He has always been the enforcer. The identity is complete, total, and absolutely impoverished. This is also, not coincidentally, what makes him so dangerous. A villain who acts out of passion can be reasoned with. A villain who acts out of ideology can be shown the flaws in their thinking. A villain who acts out of desperation can be offered alternatives. But a villain who acts out of sheer professional habit, who destroys because that is simply what he does, who has no inner life that exists independently of his function, that villain is almost impossible to stop. Because there is nothing to appeal to, no weakness to exploit, no doubt to amplify, no hidden desire for redemption to activate. Conquest does not want to be redeemed. He does not want to be understood. He does not want anything except to do his job and to feel the particular satisfaction that comes from doing it well. And his job is to break things that do not want to be broken. Let us talk about the first fight between Conquest and Mark Grayson, because it is one of the most important sequences in the entire Invincible series, not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about both characters. Conquest arrives on Earth because Mark has failed to prepare the planet for Viltrumite colonization. This is not a surprise attack or a personal vendetta. It is a performance review. The Empire sent Mark's father, Nolan, to do a job. Nolan failed. They gave the job to Mark. Mark refused. And so they sent Conquest, because Conquest is what happens when refusal is not an acceptable outcome. He is the Empire's final argument, the conversation that happens only in fists. The fight itself is staggering in its violence. Robert Kirkman and artist Ryan Ottley created something that, even by comic book standards, pushes the boundaries of what superhero combat looks like. Conquest does not just hit Mark. He systematically dismantles him. He breaks his arm, he tears into his body. He treats Mark's resistance not as a challenge to be met, but as an error to be corrected. There is a clinical quality to Conquest's violence that makes it more disturbing than any amount of rage or sadism could. He is not angry. He is not enjoying himself in the way that a sadist enjoys inflicting pain. He is experiencing something closer to the satisfaction of a craftsman doing skilled work. Each blow is purposeful. Each injury is calculated. He knows exactly how much force to apply and exactly what effect it will have. There is a detail in the comics that is easy to miss but worth noting. When Conquest arrives, the other heroes, the Guardians of the Globe, are dealt with almost as an afterthought. He slaps Oliver, Mark's half-brother, aside with casual contempt. He barely registers the existence of other defenders. This is not overconfidence. It is accurate assessment. By Viltrumite standards, everything on Earth other than Mark is beneath notice. The entire planet is beneath notice. The only reason Conquest is here at all is because Mark is half Viltrumite, which means Mark is the only being on this world who registers as real to Conquest. Everyone else is furniture, scenery, the background noise of a planet that has not yet learned its place. This casual dismissal of an entire world's worth of heroes tells you something important about how the Viltrumite philosophy warps perception. Conquest is not being arrogant when he ignores Earth's defenders. He is being accurate within his framework. If strength is the only measure of value, then Earth's heroes are valueless. Their courage does not matter. Their dedication does not matter. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves for each other does not matter. Only their power levels matter, and their power levels are, by Viltrumite standards, negligible. Conquest does not dismiss them out of cruelty. He dismisses them because his philosophy literally does not have a category for what they are. They are strong by human standards, but human standards are not real standards. Not to a Viltrumite, not to Conquest. What makes this fight particularly significant is how it functions as a kind of philosophical argument made physical. Conquest's every movement says the same thing. You are not strong enough. Your resistance is futile. The Empire is inevitable. He does not need to speak these words because his fists speak them for him. Each time Mark gets up, Conquest puts him down again. Each time Mark finds a new reserve of strength, Conquest matches it and exceeds it. The message is relentless, and it is the same message the Viltrumite Empire has been delivering to the galaxy for thousands of years. Resistance is not just futile. It is philosophically incoherent. You cannot resist us because the fact that we can overpower you proves that we should overpower you. Strength is virtue. Power is legitimacy. If you were meant to be free, you would be strong enough to stay free. And then something happens that Conquest did not account for. Adam Eve, Mark's girlfriend, intervenes. Eve is a superhero whose powers allow her to manipulate matter at the subatomic level, but she has unconscious mental blocks that prevent her from using her abilities to their full potential. When Conquest attacks her, when he injures her so severely that her body begins to fail, something extraordinary happens. Those mental blocks shatter. Eve's body begins to glow. She rebuilds herself at the molecular level, and she unleashes a blast of energy that burns the skin from Conquest's body. This is a pivotal moment, and not just because it saves Mark's life. It is pivotal because it introduces something into the equation that the Viltrumite philosophy has no framework for understanding. Love. Sacrifice. The willingness to put yourself in harm's way, not because you are strong enough to win, but because someone you care about needs you. Eve does not fight Conquest because she thinks she can beat him. She fights him because Mark is dying. Her power does not come from the Viltrumite virtues of strength and dominance. It comes from the very things the Viltrumites have systematically eliminated from their culture. Emotional connection, vulnerability, the willingness to break yourself open for someone else. There is a beautiful paradox in what happens to Eve during this fight. Her mental blocks, the limits on her powers, exist because her mind is trying to protect her from the full implications of what she can do. She can manipulate matter at the subatomic level, which means, in theory, she can do anything. Reshape reality, rebuild her body from nothing, alter the fundamental structure of the universe at a local scale. Her mind limits these abilities because the human psyche is not designed to handle that kind of power. The limits are a form of psychological self-preservation, and the only thing that can override them is a threat so extreme that self-preservation becomes irrelevant. In Eve's case, that threat is not to herself, it is to Mark. Her love for him overrides her survival instinct. The desire to save him overrides the psychological safeguards that keep her powers in check. And the result is a display of power that even Conquest, a 5,000-year-old veteran of countless battles, has never encountered before. Conquest cannot comprehend this, not because he is stupid, far from it, but because his entire worldview has no category for it. In the Viltrumite framework, Eve's intervention makes no sense. She is weaker than Conquest. She should not have fought him. Her injuries should have been the end of her involvement. The fact that her love for Mark literally unlocked a new level of power is, from a Viltrumite perspective, a contradiction in terms. Power comes from strength. Strength comes from surviving. Surviving comes from being harder than everyone else. It does not come from caring so much about another person that your body rewrites its own limitations. And yet it does. In the world of Invincible, it does. And that is the beginning of the end for Conquest, even though he does not die in this first encounter. Because what Eve demonstrates is that the Viltrumite philosophy is incomplete. There are sources of power that the Viltrumites have never accounted for because they eliminated them from their own society thousands of years ago. They bred out compassion, they killed off tenderness, they made love a weakness to be purged. And in doing so, they cut themselves off from an entire dimension of strength that they are fundamentally incapable of accessing. The Viltrumites are like a species that evolved without eyes and then declared that sight does not exist. They have defined the universe according to their own limitations and mistaken those limitations for truths. This connects to a broader theme in the Invincible series, which is the question of what power actually is. The Viltrumites have one definition of power. It is physical. It is measurable. It is expressed in how hard you can hit and how much damage you can absorb. But the series, over the course of its 144 issues, systematically introduces other forms of power that the Viltrumite definition cannot account for. Eve's power comes from her connection to the subatomic structure of reality, but it is unlocked by love. Alan the alien's power comes from his willingness to serve a cause larger than himself. Even Cecil Stedman, an ordinary human with no superpowers at all, wields a form of power that the Viltrumites consistently underestimate. The power of intelligence, of strategic thinking, of building systems and institutions that can accomplish what no individual, no matter how strong, can accomplish alone. The Viltrumites look at Cecil and see a weak, fragile, disposable being. What they do not see is the architect of an entire planetary defense network that has, on multiple occasions, stymied their plans. They cannot see it because their definition of power does not include the word architect. It only includes the word warrior. And that blindness, that fundamental inability to recognize forms of strength that do not match their own, is the fatal flaw at the heart of the Empire. Conquest embodies this blindness more completely than any other character. He encounters Eve's unlocked powers and does not understand them. He encounters Mark's refusal to surrender and reads it as stubbornness rather than love. He encounters human civilization and sees only a collection of weak beings waiting to be subjugated, never noticing the art, the science, the philosophy, the music, the literature, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human inquiry into the nature of existence. None of it registers, because none of it is strength, as he defines strength, and he cannot define it any other way. Mark survives the first fight with Conquest, barely. He is left broken in ways that go beyond the physical. The experience of being so thoroughly outmatched, of being reduced to raw meat by a being who treated the whole affair as a minor professional obligation, changes something in Mark. It forces him to confront a question that he has been avoiding since he first learned the truth about his father's heritage. Am I like them? Am I a Viltrumite? Not just genetically, but philosophically. Is the capacity for this kind of violence inside me? And if it is, what separates me from Conquest? This is a question that resonates far beyond the world of Invincible. It is the question that every person faces when they discover the capacity for darkness within themselves. We all have it. The capacity for cruelty, for violence, for the kind of cold indifference that allows one person to destroy another without remorse. It lives in all of us, buried under layers of socialization, empathy, and moral education. And for most of us, those layers hold. We never have to confront the thing beneath them. But Mark does, because Mark is half Viltrumite. The violence is not just a hypothetical. It is in his blood. It is in his muscles. It is in the way his fists connect with flesh, and the way sometimes, in the worst moments, it feels right. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote about what he called the shadow, the part of the personality that contains everything the conscious self rejects, the impulses we deny, the desires we suppress, the capacities we refuse to acknowledge. Jung argued that the shadow is not evil in itself. It is merely the unintegrated part of the self. And the work of psychological maturity is not to destroy the shadow, but to integrate it, to acknowledge it, to understand it, to find a way to include it in a complete picture of who you are without letting it dominate. This idea of the shadow is one of the most useful concepts in psychology, and it applies to Conquest in a way that Jung himself might not have anticipated. Because Conquest is not someone who has a shadow. Conquest is a shadow. He is the unintegrated darkness of an entire civilization. externalized and given a body and a mission. The Viltrumites created Conquest the same way a person creates their shadow, by pushing everything they do not want to acknowledge about themselves into a separate container and then pretending that container is something other than them. The other Viltrumites fear Conquest because they can sense on some level that he is the part of themselves they have refused to face. He is the full, undiluted expression of their philosophy, and they do not like what they see. They prefer a more diluted version. A version that allows for some small comforts, some minor pleasures, some thin veneer of civility over the fundamental brutality of their worldview. Conquest has no veneer. He is the thing itself, and the thing itself is terrifying, even to those who created it. Mark's arc in the Invincible comics is fundamentally about shadow integration. His shadow is his Viltrumite heritage, the capacity for violence, the ability to hit so hard that continents crack. The part of him that could, if he let it, enjoy the fight the way Conquest enjoys it. And the first fight with Conquest is the moment when that shadow is dragged into the light, when Mark can no longer pretend that he is purely his mother's son, purely human, purely good. He has to face the fact that the same power that makes him a hero is the same power that makes Conquest a destroyer. The difference is not in the power itself, it is in what you do with it. And what you do with it depends on who you are. And who you are depends on everything the Viltrumites have spent 5,000 years trying to eliminate. The second fight between Mark and Conquest takes place during the Viltrumite War, and it is in many ways even more significant than the first. By this point, Conquest has recovered from his injuries, escaped from confinement under the supervision of Cecil Stedman on Earth, and reported back to Grand Regent Thrag. He has been reassigned, sent to intercept Omni-Man and Alan the Alien, who are transporting Mark and others to aid the coalition of planets in their fight against the Empire. When Mark sees Conquest again, the dynamic has shifted. Mark is no longer the overwhelmed young hero who nearly died in their first encounter. He is harder, angrier, more willing to do what needs to be done. What follows is a fight that strips both characters down to their most essential selves. There are no grand strategies, no clever tricks, no last-minute saves from allies with hidden powers. It is just Mark and Conquest, locked in combat in the vacuum of space, each trying to kill the other through the most direct means available. Mark grabs Conquest and begins to strangle him. Conquest, even as he is being suffocated, continues to fight. He disembowels Mark, he tears at him with his remaining arm and his cybernetic prosthetic. He refuses to stop, even as his body begins to fail, because stopping is not something he knows how to do. Stopping would mean admitting that something other than his own will had determined the outcome, and that would be a betrayal of everything he has ever been. What is remarkable about this second fight is how different Mark's approach is from the first encounter. In the first fight, Mark fought like a superhero. He threw punches, he tried to outmaneuver Conquest. He used the techniques he had learned, the strategies that had worked against every other enemy he had faced. And Conquest dismantled all of it because Conquest has been fighting longer than human civilization has existed. And he has seen every technique, every strategy, every desperate improvisation that a lesser opponent can produce. None of it was new to him. None of it was surprising. Mark's superhero training was useless against a being who had been fighting before the concept of the superhero existed. In the second fight, Mark abandons all of that. He does not try to outfight Conquest. He does not try to outsmart him. He just grabs hold and refuses to let go. It is the simplest possible approach, and it is the one thing Conquest cannot counter, because countering it would require breaking free, and breaking free would require Mark to release his grip. And Mark would rather die than release his grip. This is the moment when Mark transcends the superhero genre entirely. He is not fighting like a hero. He is fighting like an animal, like a human being stripped down to the most basic, most primal, most desperate level of survival instinct. And that rawness, that refusal to be anything other than what the moment requires, is what Conquest, with all his refinement and all his experience, cannot match. There is a grim intimacy to this fight that sets it apart from their first encounter. In the first fight, there was distance. Conquest was the professional, and Mark was the assignment. But in this second fight, that distance has collapsed. They are wrapped around each other like lovers in a terrible embrace. They are breathing each other's blood. They are feeling each other die, one in increments of oxygen deprivation and the other in increments of evisceration. It is the closest thing to genuine human contact that Conquest has experienced in possibly thousands of years, and that thought should make you deeply uncomfortable, because it suggests that for a being like Conquest, violence is not just a substitute for intimacy. It is the only form of intimacy available, the only way he can be close to another being, the only context in which he is fully present, fully engaged, fully alive. Mark kills Conquest by suffocating him, He holds on while Conquest tears him apart, and he does not let go until the old warrior is dead. It is an act of extraordinary courage and extraordinary violence, and it raises the question that the entire Conquest arc has been building toward. Did Mark become like Conquest to defeat him? Did he have to access that same cold, relentless Viltrumite capacity for violence in order to overcome the purest expression of Viltrumite violence? And if he did, what does that mean for who Mark is? The answer, and this is where Invincible earns its reputation as one of the most thoughtful superhero comics ever written, is complicated. Yes, Mark had to reach into the Viltrumite part of himself to kill Conquest. He had to find that cold place inside him where pain does not matter and mercy is not an option. He had to become, for a few terrible minutes, exactly the kind of being that Conquest is, a weapon, a force of pure, focused destruction. But here's the crucial difference. Mark came back. After the fight, after the killing, Mark Grayson was still Mark Grayson. He was still a person who loved Adam Eve, who cared about his mother, who wanted to protect the world not because it was his job, but because it was his home. The Viltrumite capacity for violence was inside him, yes, but it was not all that was inside him, and the ability to access that darkness without being consumed by it, to use it when necessary and then set it aside, is precisely what separates Mark from Conquest. This is a profoundly important distinction, and it applies to far more than superhero comics. Every human being contains multitudes. We are all capable of kindness and cruelty, of creation and destruction, of love and indifference. The question is not whether the capacity for darkness exists within us. It does. The question is whether we can integrate it, whether we can acknowledge it without being defined by it, whether we can, when the situation demands it, access the full spectrum of our capabilities, and then return to ourselves afterward. Conquest cannot do this. He has been in the dark so long that he has forgotten there is anything else. Mark can, and that is why Mark wins. But there is another layer to this that is worth exploring, because it gets at something even more fundamental about the nature of strength. The Viltrumite philosophy holds that strength is the only virtue. But what kind of strength are they talking about? Physical strength, obviously. The ability to punch through a planet, to fly faster than light, to survive injuries that would kill any other being in the universe. These are the strengths that the Viltrumites value. These are the strengths that Conquest has spent 5,000 years perfecting. And they are real strengths. They matter. In a universe where beings like Conquest exist, the ability to hit hard and take a hit is not something you can afford to dismiss. But the Invincible series makes a compelling case that these are not the only kinds of strength, or even the most important ones. The strength to love someone and risk losing them. The strength to admit you were wrong. The strength to change, to grow, to become something other than what you were born to be. The strength to endure not just physical pain, but emotional pain. The pain of uncertainty, of vulnerability, of opening yourself to another person knowing they could hurt you in ways that no punch ever could. These are strengths that the Viltrumites by design have eliminated from their culture. And their absence is not a sign of superiority. It is a catastrophic vulnerability. Because the Viltrumites, for all their power, cannot adapt. They cannot evolve. They cannot respond to circumstances that their philosophy does not account for. When Nolan falls in love with a human woman and decides that his son is worth more than the Empire, the Viltrumites have no response except to send someone to beat him into submission. When Mark refuses to conquer Earth, they have no strategy except escalation. Send Conquest. Break the boy. Make an example of him. And when that does not work, they are lost, because the only tool they have is a hammer, and they have been hitting things with it for so long that they have forgotten there are other tools. Conquest is the ultimate hammer. He is the tool the Empire reaches for when all other tools have failed. And there is something tragic about this, if you let yourself see it. Here is a being of almost incomprehensible power and experience, 5,000 years of life, an intellect sharpened by millennia of strategic thinking, a body that can shatter mountains. And what has the Empire done with him? What has his civilization, his culture, his species asked of this remarkable being? They have asked him to break things. That is it. That is all. 5,000 years of existence reduced to a single function, the most powerful hammer in the universe, and no one ever thought to teach him how to build. There is a school of existential psychology that deals with what happens to human beings when they are denied meaning. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, wrote about how the prisoners who survived the concentration camps were often not the physically strongest. They were the ones who managed to find meaning in their suffering, a reason to keep going, a purpose that transcended their immediate circumstances. Frankl argued that the fundamental human drive is not pleasure, as Freud suggested, or power, as Adler proposed, but meaning. We need to feel that our lives matter, that our actions have significance beyond the immediate moment, that we are part of something larger than ourselves. By this measure, Conquest is one of the most psychologically devastated characters in all of fiction. Not because he has been traumatized in the conventional sense, though 5,000 years of violence would certainly qualify, but because his life, for all its extraordinary length and power, is devoid of genuine meaning. He serves the Empire, yes, but the Empire's only purpose is its own perpetuation. He conquers planets, yes, but the conquests lead nowhere, produce nothing, create nothing of value. He fights, yes, but the fights are all essentially the same, and they all end the same way, with submission or death. There is no growth, no progression, no narrative arc, just repetition. 5,000 years of the same story, told over and over on different planets, with different victims, and always the same ending. This is Frankel's existential vacuum made flesh. A being with all the power in the universe and no meaning to attach it to. And the tragedy is not that Conquest suffers from this vacuum. The tragedy is that he does not even know it exists. He has been so thoroughly conditioned by the Viltrumite philosophy that the absence of meaning does not register as absence. It registers as normalcy, as the way things are, as the way things should be. He does not feel empty because emptiness is all he has ever known, and you cannot miss what you have never had. This is why when the comics describe the other Viltrumites as avoiding Conquest, as being afraid of him, as considering him unstable, you should read that fear not as respect, but as recognition. They can see what he has become. They can see the emptiness in him. And it frightens them because it is a mirror. It shows them what the Viltrumite philosophy produces when it is followed without compromise. They all contain the potential to become Conquest. Every Viltrumite warrior, every agent of the Empire, is on the same path. Conquest has simply walked it longer and further than anyone else. He is not an aberration. He is a destination. Consider what the Viltrumite Empire must look like from the inside. You are born into the most powerful species in the known universe. Your body can survive the vacuum of space. You can fly at speeds that mock physics. You will live for thousands of years. And what are you told to do with all of this? Conquer, subjugate, enforce. That is it. There is no Viltrumite art that we know of, no Viltrumite literature, no Viltrumite music or philosophy or science pursued for its own sake. Everything is in service of the Empire. Everything is oriented toward expansion and control. Imagine being born with the power of a god and being told that the only acceptable use of that power is to make other people kneel. Some Viltrumites rebel against this in their way. Nolan's entire arc is about a Viltrumite who discovers, almost by accident, that there is more to existence than the Empire's philosophy allows. Mark's arc is about a half-Viltrumite who inherits the power without the ideology, and must figure out what to do with it. Even Thrag, the Grand Regent, has a kind of tragic grandeur, because he is intelligent enough to understand the limitations of the system he maintains, but too committed to it to seek an alternative. But Conquest does not rebel. He does not question. He does not even seem to experience the vague dissatisfaction that afflicts other Viltrumites who have spent enough time away from the Empire to catch a glimpse of other possibilities. He is pure, undiluted, the Viltrumite ideal in its most concentrated form. And that purity is what makes him so terrifying. Not his strength, though his strength is considerable. Not his experience, though 5,000 years of combat have made him one of the most skilled fighters in the universe. Not even his willingness to kill, though that willingness is absolute. What makes Conquest terrifying is his completeness. He is exactly what the Viltrumite Empire intended to produce. He is the end product of their philosophy, the proof of concept for their entire civilization. And he is empty, devastatingly, echoingly, absolutely empty. This is the argument that Invincible makes, not through exposition or dialogue, but through the simple fact of Conquest's existence. The philosophy of strength as the only virtue does not produce supermen. It produces sophisticated weapon systems with faces. It takes beings of extraordinary potential and grinds them down to a single sharp point. It is effective, absolutely. Conquest does his job. He has never failed prior to his encounters with Mark Grayson. But effectiveness is not the same as fulfillment. Efficiency is not the same as meaning. And power, even godlike power, is not the same as purpose. Let us shift our attention now to what Conquest's role in the animated series adds to this understanding. In the show, Conquest first appears in the 7th episode of the 3rd season, voiced by Jeffrey Dean Morgan. The casting is itself a piece of philosophical commentary, even if it was not intended as such. Jeffrey Dean Morgan is perhaps best known for playing Negan in The Walking Dead, a character who is in many ways a human-scale version of Conquest. Negan ruled through violence. He maintained control through fear. He turned the act of destruction into a ritual, a performance, a way of asserting dominance that was as much psychological as physical. But Negan, for all his brutality, was recognizably human. He had desires beyond domination. He had a past that explained, if not excused, his present. He was capable of change. Steven Yeun, who voices Mark Grayson in Invincible, played Glenn in The Walking Dead, the character that Negan famously killed in one of the show's most notorious scenes. So when Jeffrey Dean Morgan's Conquest faces off against Steven Yeun's Invincible, there is a layer of resonance that deepens the encounter. These are two actors who have played this dynamic before, the overwhelming force of violence meeting the stubborn refusal to yield. And the fact that both shows arrive at the same conclusion, that violence alone cannot sustain a worldview, that brute force eventually encounters something it cannot break, gives the Invincible version of this conflict an additional weight. In the animated series, Conquest arrives on Earth in the Season 3 finale because Mark has not prepared the planet for a Viltrumite takeover. His arrival is not dramatic in the way that most villain introductions are. There is no ominous music building to a crescendo, no slow reveal from shadow into light, no monologue about his terrible power delivered to a cowering audience. He simply appears, an old Viltrumite with one arm and a face that suggests a long familiarity with suffering, both giving and receiving. And he begins to do what he has always done, what he was built to do, what 5,000 years of existence have refined him into being uniquely qualified to do. The fight that follows in the animated series carries forward everything the comics established while adding the dimension of performance that animation and voice acting provide. Jeffrey Dean Morgan brings a quiet menace to Conquest that is, in some ways, more disturbing than outright aggression would be. His Conquest sounds tired. Not physically tired, Viltrumites do not tire easily, but existentially tired. The way someone sounds who has been doing the same job for too long, who knows every variation of every situation they will ever encounter, who has run out of surprises. When Conquest speaks to Mark, there is no hatred in his voice. There is barely even interest. There is just the flat, professional tone of someone who has done this 1,000 times before, and fully expects to do it 1,000 times again. This vocal performance captures something essential about the character that the comics, for all their brilliance, could only suggest through visual storytelling: the exhaustion of infinity. The wariness of a being who will never run out of time but ran out of reasons to fill it centuries ago. When you hear Morgan's voice coming from this ancient warrior, you hear the sound of a purpose that has been carried so long it has worn a groove in the soul. Not a passionate purpose, not a burning mission, just a groove, a rut, a path so deeply worn that leaving it would require more effort than following it, even though following it leads nowhere new and never has. This is where the philosophy of Conquest, lowercase c, becomes indistinguishable from the character of Conquest, uppercase C. Because what the character embodies is not just the Viltrumite philosophy of strength. He embodies the logical endpoint of all philosophies that reduce existence to a single dimension: the philosophy of pure strength, the philosophy of pure efficiency, the philosophy of pure rationality. Any system of thought that takes one aspect of the human experience, or the Viltrumite experience, or any sentient experience, and declares it the only one that matters, will eventually produce something like Conquest, a being of extraordinary capability in one narrow domain and absolute poverty in every other domain. A being who can break planets but cannot build relationships, who can conquer civilizations but cannot create culture, who can survive for millennia but cannot find a reason to live beyond the next mission. Think about what this means for the Viltrumite Empire as a whole. If Conquest is the logical endpoint of their philosophy, and Conquest is fundamentally empty, then the Empire itself is building toward emptiness. Every planet it conquers, every civilization it pacifies, every species it subjugates, all of it is in service of a project that has no endpoint, no culmination, no moment of arrival. The Empire does not have a vision of what the universe will look like when it is finished conquering. It does not have a plan for what comes after total dominion, because in the Viltrumite framework, there is no after. Conquest is not a means to an end. It is the end. The Empire conquers in order to have conquered, and then it conquers again. It is an engine with no destination, a machine that runs for the sake of running, and the fuel it burns is the lives and cultures and possibilities of every world it touches. This is fundamentally different from how even the most aggressive human empires have operated. The Roman Empire, for all its military brutality, had a vision of civilization: Roman roads, Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman culture. These were not just tools of domination. They were expressions of a belief that the Roman way of life was worth spreading. You could argue that this belief was arrogant, self-serving, and blind to the value of the cultures it displaced. And you would be right, but at least it was a belief in something beyond the act of conquest itself. At least it imagined a world that was better, by some definition of better, for having been conquered. The Viltrumites imagine nothing. They do not bring Roman roads to the planets they subjugate. They do not share Viltrumite philosophy, because Viltrumite philosophy amounts to little more than the assertion that the strong should rule the weak. They do not build. They occupy. And there is a profound difference between an empire that conquers in order to build and an empire that conquers in order to conquer. The first is flawed but generative. The second is the Viltrum Empire. The second is Conquest. The great irony of Conquest's existence is that the empire he serves so faithfully does not value him as a person. It values him as a tool. When Conquest fails to subdue Mark in their first encounter, the empire does not express concern for his well-being. It does not offer him support or time to recover. It reassigns him, sends him on another mission, uses him until he is used up. And when Mark finally kills him, the empire does not mourn. There is no Viltrumite funeral for Conquest, no memorial, no moment of recognition for 5,000 years of loyal service. He is simply gone. One tool broken to be replaced by another. The philosophy of strength has no room for grief. Grief implies that the lost individual had value beyond their utility. And in the Viltrumite framework, no one does. This is the emptiness at the heart of the Viltrumite ideal, and Conquest is its most eloquent expression. Not eloquent in words, Conquest is not much of a talker, but eloquent in being. His existence is a kind of argument, a living proof by demonstration of what happens when you build a civilization on the foundation of strength alone. You get beings like Conquest, powerful, feared, effective, and hollow, so hollow that the sound of their fists striking flesh is the loudest thing about them. So hollow that the only way they know they exist is by the damage they leave behind. There is a Buddhist concept called shunyata, often translated as emptiness, but meaning something quite different from the Western understanding of the word. In Buddhist philosophy, emptiness does not mean nothingness. It means the absence of inherent independent existence. Everything that exists in relation to other things. Nothing stands alone. Nothing is truly self-contained. To understand emptiness in the Buddhist sense is to understand interconnection, to see that you are not a separate, isolated entity, but a node in an infinite web of relationships and dependencies. This is considered a liberating insight, to realize that you are not alone, that you never were alone, that aloneness itself is an illusion created by the ego's insistence on its own separateness, is to be freed from the fear of isolation that drives so much of human suffering. Conquest, by this measure, is a study in the wrong kind of emptiness. He is empty not in the Buddhist sense of being connected to everything, but in the nihilistic sense of being connected to nothing. 5,000 years of life and no genuine relationships, no dependencies, no web of connection that gives his existence meaning or context. He has achieved a kind of terrible independence, the independence of a stone floating in space, completely free, completely alone, completely purposeless. The Viltrumite philosophy promised him strength. It delivered isolation, it promised him power, it delivered emptiness, it promised him meaning through conquest. It delivered an infinite loop of violence that goes nowhere and means nothing. Now consider what it means that Mark Grayson, in order to defeat this emptiness, had to enter it, had to take the Viltrumite violence inside him and channel it with the same cold precision that Conquest uses. Had to hold on while Conquest tore him apart, not because he was stronger, but because he was willing to endure more. In that moment, from the outside, Mark and Conquest look identical. Two beings locked in a death grip, each trying to destroy the other through sheer unrelenting force. The difference is entirely internal. Mark is fighting for something, for the people he loves, for the world he calls home, for the possibility of a future in which strength serves something greater than itself. Conquest is fighting because fighting is all he knows. And this internal difference, invisible from the outside, undetectable by any physical measurement, is what ultimately determines the outcome. Mark wins not because he is stronger than Conquest. By most measures, he is not. Mark wins because his fighting has meaning, because the same act of violence performed by two different beings for two different reasons produces two fundamentally different results. Conquest's violence is self-referential. It points only to itself. It is violence for the sake of violence, destruction for the sake of the empire, which exists for the sake of destruction. It is a circle, a closed system, an act that generates nothing beyond its own repetition. Mark's violence, in the moment he kills Conquest, is directional. It points toward something, toward Eve. toward his mother, toward the planet full of people who will never know what happened in the vacuum of space above their world. It is not good violence, if such a thing can be said to exist. It is not clean or noble or righteous. It is brutal and bloody, and it costs Mark something precious. A piece of his innocence, a piece of his certainty that he is nothing like his father's people. But it is meaningful violence, violence with a purpose beyond itself. And that purpose, however imperfect, however compromised by the act it requires, is enough to tip the balance. This is the secret that the Invincible series reveals through the character of Conquest. Wholeness beats perfection. Not always, not easily, not without cost, but in the end, a being who brings their full self to a conflict, who fights with meaning and purpose and connection, will outlast a being who has been sharpened to a single, perfect, and ultimately brittle point. Conquest is a blade without a handle, the sharpest edge in the universe, but impossible to wield without cutting yourself. Mark is a blunter instrument, but he is whole, and wholeness in the long run is more durable than sharpness. You can see this most clearly in the difference between how Conquest and Mark approach their second fight. Conquest fights with technique, with 5,000 years of refined skill, with a strategic mind that can read an opponent's weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. His fighting style is, in a word, perfect. There is nothing wasted, no unnecessary movement, no emotional contamination. It is fighting as engineering, violence as applied science, and it is effective, devastatingly effective. Against almost any opponent, this approach is unbeatable. But Mark does not fight like a Viltrumite, or rather, he fights like a Viltrumite who is also something else. His fighting is messy, emotional, driven by love and fear and anger and desperation. He makes mistakes. He leaves openings. He does things that Conquest would never do because they are tactically unsound. But he also does things that Conquest cannot do because Conquest has forgotten how. Mark fights with his whole self, not just the Viltrumite part, not just the trained warrior part, the part that is his mother's son, the part that is Eve's partner, the part that wants to see tomorrow, not because tomorrow will bring another mission, but because tomorrow is when he gets to go home. There is something else the second fight reveals that deserves attention. When Mark strangles Conquest, he is not using a Viltrumite technique. He is not applying some ancient martial strategy refined over millennia. He is doing the most basic, the most primitive, the most fundamentally human thing possible. He is holding on. That is it. That is the entire strategy. Hold on and do not let go. It is not elegant. It is not beautiful. It is not the kind of fighting that would impress a Viltrumite military academy. It is the fighting style of a drowning person who has found a piece of driftwood, and it works. It works because Conquest, for all his 5,000 years of refined combat technique, has no answer for someone who simply refuses to stop. His training prepared him for every possible attack, but it did not prepare him for someone who would rather die than release their grip. Because in the Viltrumite framework, dying is losing, and losing is unacceptable. A Viltrumite who is being killed should fight back, should find a way to reverse the situation, should apply superior technique and strength to overcome the threat. What a Viltrumite should not do is simply hold on. That is not a strategy. That is desperation. And the Viltrumites do not have a protocol for desperation, because desperation is a form of weakness, and weakness has no place in their philosophy. But desperation, as it turns out, is its own kind of strength. The strength of someone who has nothing left to lose. The strength of someone who has already accepted the worst possible outcome and decided that it is preferable to giving up. Mark is being disemboweled while he strangles Conquest. His intestines are exposed to the vacuum of space. By any medical standard, he should be dead. By any military standard, he is already lost. But he does not let go, because letting go would mean that Conquest was right. That strength is the only virtue, that the strong deserve to win and the weak deserve to lose. And Mark, in his bones, in the part of him that is his mother's son, knows that this is not true. He knows it the way you know that the sun will rise. Not because someone told him, not because he reasoned it out, but because it is woven into the fabric of who he is. And that fabric holds, even when his body does not. This is not just a superhero lesson. It is a human one. We live in a world that often asks us to become Conquest, to specialize, to optimize, to eliminate everything from our lives that does not serve our primary function. To be the best at one thing, even if it means being nothing at all in every other dimension. The cult of productivity, the worship of efficiency, the belief that the successful person is the one who has most thoroughly subordinated every aspect of their existence to a single goal. These are echoes of the Viltrumite philosophy, softened for human consumption, but carrying the same fundamental message. Strength, however you define it, is the only virtue. Everything else is a distraction. You can see this in the way people talk about their lives when they reach the end of them. Hospice workers and palliative care nurses consistently report that the dying rarely regret not working harder. They rarely wish they had been more productive, more efficient, more optimized. What they regret is the relationships they neglected, the experiences they postponed, the parts of themselves they sacrificed in the name of goals that, from the vantage point of a deathbed, turn out to have been less important than they seemed. They regret, in other words, having lived like Conquest, having been so focused on the mission that they forgot to be a person, having been so good at one thing that they never got around to being good at the things that actually matter when the mission is over and all that remains is who you were when you were not working. Conquest will never have this realization because Conquest will never retire. He will never sit on a porch and look back on his life and wonder if he should have done things differently. He will fight until he is killed, and then he will stop existing, and the Empire will not pause to remember him. There will be no moment of reckoning, no deathbed clarity, no last-minute understanding of what was lost. And that is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the Viltrumite philosophy. It does not just deny meaning to its adherents. It denies them the possibility of ever recognizing what they have been denied. It is a prison that feels like freedom, a trap that feels like purpose, a death that feels like life. And Conquest is what happens when you follow that message all the way to the end. 5,000 years of strength, 5,000 years of effectiveness, 5,000 years of being the best at the one thing he was told to be good at. And at the end of those 5,000 years, nothing. No love, no growth. No legacy beyond the rubble of broken worlds and the fear in other people's eyes. Nothing to show for 5 millennia of existence except a cybernetic arm, a scarred face, and a professional reputation as the being you call when you want something destroyed. The Viltrumites feared Conquest. They should have pitied him, because Conquest is not a monster. He is a cautionary tale. He is what happens when a civilization decides that strength is all that matters and then follows that decision through generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, until the beings it produces are so thoroughly optimized for destruction that they have lost the capacity for anything else. He is the answer to the question that the Viltrumite philosophy asks but never wants answered. What does perfect strength look like? It looks like Conquest, powerful, feared, effective, and utterly devastatingly alone. There is one more thing worth saying about the nature of Conquest's violence before we move on, and it has to do with what the philosopher Simone Weil called force. Weil, writing during World War II, defined force as that which turns a person into a thing. Not just physically, though, physical violence certainly qualifies, but psychologically, socially, existentially. Force is what happens when one being exercises power over another in a way that strips the second being of their agency, their dignity, their personhood. It turns a subject into an object, a who into a what, a living, thinking, feeling person into an item on a list, a number in a ledger, a body on the ground. This is exactly what Conquest does, not just to the people he fights, but to himself. He has been exercising force for so long on so many worlds against so many beings that the transformation has become total and reciprocal. He turned others into things, and in the process, he turned himself into a thing, a tool, an instrument, a delivery mechanism for imperial policy. The force he wielded against the galaxy rebounded against him and made him less than he was, less than he could have been. Less than any being with 5,000 years of life and the power to reshape the universe should be. He is the purest example of Weil's insight, that force dehumanizes not just the victim, but the one who wields it. That the act of turning another person into a thing inevitably turns you into a thing as well. That violence, wielded habitually and without reflection, is not just an act committed against others. It is an act committed against yourself. There is a phrase that has echoed through political philosophy for over 2,000 years, and it begins with a man named Thrasymachus. In Book 1 of Plato's Republic, written around 380 BCE, Thrasymachus interrupts a polite conversation about justice to make a claim that shocks the room. Justice, he says, is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger. What we call right, what we call moral, what we call just, is simply whatever benefits those who have the power to enforce their will. The strong make the rules. The weak obey them. And any talk of justice as some independent, objective standard is a fairy tale told by the powerful to keep the powerless compliant. Thrasymachus was not making a moral argument. He was making an observational one. He was pointing at the world and saying, look at how things actually work. Forget how you wish they worked. Forget your ideals and your principles and your carefully reasoned ethical systems. Look at what happens in practice. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. That is the only law that has never been broken. The Viltrumite Empire is Thrasymachus writ large. It is his observation elevated to a governing philosophy, a foreign policy, a way of organizing an entire galactic civilization. And Conquest is the embodied argument. He does not need to quote Thrasymachus. He does not need to articulate the position. He is the position. Every planet he breaks is a demonstration. Every civilization he subjugates is evidence. Every body he leaves behind is a footnote in the longest, most violent philosophical paper ever written. And its thesis is always the same. The strong deserve to rule because they are strong. The weak deserve to submit because they are weak. And if you disagree, your disagreement is itself a form of weakness. Because if you were truly strong, you would not need to disagree. You would simply take what you wanted. Now, Plato spent the rest of the Republic building an elaborate counter-argument to Thrasymachus. He argued through the voice of Socrates that justice is not merely the advantage of the stronger, but a kind of harmony, a balance within the soul and within the state, where each part performs its proper function. The just person, Socrates argued, is happier than the unjust person, even if the unjust person has more power and more wealth, because justice is its own reward. It produces a well-ordered soul, a soul at peace with itself, a soul that functions as it was designed to function. Injustice, by contrast, produces internal conflict. The tyrant, the person who has absolute power and uses it without restraint, is actually the most miserable person alive, because their soul is in constant turmoil. They are slaves to their appetites, their fears, their insatiable need for more. Apply this to Conquest and something interesting happens. By Socrates' measure, Conquest should be the most miserable being in the galaxy. He has absolute power. He uses it without restraint. He is the Viltrumite tyrant that Plato warned about, the soul so disordered by unchecked power that it can no longer function as anything other than a machine of destruction. And yet Conquest does not appear to be miserable. He does not appear to be anything. That blankness, that absence of visible suffering, might seem like evidence against Plato's argument. But consider another possibility. What if the misery is so total, so pervasive, so deeply woven into the fabric of Conquest's existence that he cannot distinguish it from normalcy? What if the disorder of his soul has become the only order he knows? A fish does not know it is wet. A being who has been miserable for 5,000 years does not know it is miserable. It simply is. The suffering has become the medium, not the message. The water, not the wave. This connects to something Thomas Hobbes wrote in 1651 in his masterwork Leviathan. And the connection is worth tracing carefully because it illuminates a dimension of Conquest that is easy to overlook. Hobbes described what he called the state of nature, a hypothetical condition in which there is no government, no law, no social contract binding people to any standard of behavior. In this state of nature, Hobbes argued, human life would be, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not because people are inherently evil, but because, in the absence of a common authority to enforce agreements and punish violations, every person is a potential threat to every other person. Trust is impossible because betrayal carries no consequence. Cooperation is unsustainable because there is nothing to prevent your partner from turning on you the moment it becomes advantageous. The state of nature is a state of war, not necessarily active combat at every moment, but a constant readiness for combat, a permanent condition of suspicion and fear. Hobbes argued that the solution to this nightmare was the social contract. Rational beings, recognizing that the state of nature is intolerable, agree to surrender some of their freedom to a sovereign authority, a Leviathan, in exchange for security and order. They give up the right to do whatever they want in order to gain the assurance that others will not do whatever they want to them. This is the foundation of political society. This is why we have governments and laws and institutions. Not because humans are naturally good and cooperative, but precisely because they are not, and they know it, and they would rather live under constraints than in a war of all against all. The Viltrum Empire is what happens when the Leviathan itself is built on the state of nature, rather than as a remedy for it. The Viltrumites did not create their empire to escape the war of all against all. They created it to institutionalize it. Their Great Purge was a formalized state of nature, a period in which every Viltrumite was set against every other Viltrumite, and the survivors earned their right to exist through violence. And then, having survived that crucible, they turned outward and imposed the same state of nature on the rest of the galaxy. The Empire is not a Leviathan that protects its subjects from chaos. It is a Leviathan that exports chaos, that arrives on peaceful worlds and introduces the very conditions Hobbes warned about: the suspicion, the fear, the knowledge that your survival depends entirely on your ability to endure whatever the powerful decide to inflict on you. Conquest is the Empire's ambassador to the state of nature. He arrives on a planet and, through the simple application of overwhelming force, strips away every social contract, every institution, every agreement that the inhabitants have built to protect themselves from exactly this kind of predation. He reduces a civilization to its most primitive condition, not to Hobbes' hypothetical state of nature, but to something worse. Because in Hobbes' state of nature, at least everyone is roughly equal. Everyone faces the same vulnerability. Everyone has the same desperate need for security. But when Conquest arrives, there is no equality. There is only him with the power to destroy anything he chooses, and everyone else with the power to die in whatever manner he permits. This is not the state of nature. This is the state of nature with a god in it. A god who does not create, a god who does not protect, a god whose only divine act is the old one, the original one, the one that precedes all theology, destruction. You might wonder whether Conquest ever pauses to consider any of this, whether in the quiet hours between assignments, he reflects on the philosophical implications of what he does. And the answer, as far as we can tell from both the comics and the animated series, is no. He does not reflect, he does not philosophize, he does not engage in the kind of self-examination that might, over the course of 5,000 years, produce something resembling wisdom. And this brings us to a thinker who stands in almost perfect opposition to everything Conquest represents: Aristotle. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE in his Nicomachean Ethics, argued that the highest human good is eudaimonia, a Greek word that is usually translated as happiness, but actually means something closer to flourishing. A flourishing life, according to Aristotle, is not one defined by pleasure or power or wealth. It is one defined by the excellent exercise of your distinctly human capacities. And the most distinctly human capacity, the thing that separates us from every other living thing, is reason. The ability to think, to deliberate, to weigh options, to consider consequences, to ask not just what can I do, but what should I do and why. A good life, in Aristotle's framework, is a life lived in accordance with virtue, where virtue means excellence, where excellence means performing your function, your uniquely human function, at the highest possible level. Aristotle had a concept he called arete, which translates roughly as excellence or virtue, and he illustrated it with a simple analogy. The arete of a knife is to cut well. The arete of an eye is to see clearly. The arete of a flute player is to play the flute beautifully. Everything has a function, and the excellence of that thing is determined by how well it performs its function. So what is the function of a human being? Not just to survive, not just to reproduce, not just to accumulate power. The function of a human being, Aristotle argued, is to live a life guided by reason, in community with others, developing and exercising the virtues, courage, temperance, justice, wisdom that allow for genuine flourishing. By Aristotle's measure, Conquest has achieved a grotesque parody of excellence. He has identified his function, or rather, had it identified for him by the Empire, and he performs it with extraordinary skill. He conquers. He does it well. He does it consistently. He has been doing it for 5,000 years with a level of proficiency that would impress even the most demanding taskmaster. If you evaluate Conquest purely on the basis of how well he performs his assigned function, he is the most excellent being the Viltrumite Empire has ever produced. He is the perfect knife, the flawless weapon, the instrument that never misses its mark. But Aristotle would have rejected this evaluation entirely, because Aristotle understood something that the Viltrumites do not. Excellence is not just about performing a function well. It is about performing the right function. A knife that cuts beautifully is excellent as a knife, but a person who does nothing but cut is not excellent as a person. A person is not a knife. A person's function is not reducible to a single action, no matter how skillfully performed. A person's function, the thing that makes a person, is the full exercise of their rational and moral capacities in the context of a social life. Community, friendship, deliberation, the pursuit of knowledge, the cultivation of character, the slow, patient work of becoming not just effective but good, in the deepest and most comprehensive sense of that word. Conquest has excised all of that. He has taken the concept of arete and amputated everything from it except efficiency. He is excellent the way a bullet is excellent. Perfect trajectory, maximum impact, complete disregard for the target's inner life. And the Viltrumite Empire celebrates this as achievement, as proof that their philosophy works, that strength really is the only virtue, that a being who does one thing supremely well is a being who has achieved the highest possible form of existence. They look at Conquest and see their greatest success. Aristotle would look at Conquest and see their greatest failure, a being of extraordinary potential who was never allowed to develop any of it. A life that could have been a symphony reduced to a single note played at maximum volume for 5,000 years. There is another philosophical tradition that offers an illuminating contrast to everything Conquest represents, and that is Stoicism. The Stoics, a school of Greek and Roman philosophers whose most famous practitioners include Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, believed that the path to a good life lay not in the pursuit of power or pleasure, but in the cultivation of inner virtue and the acceptance of what lies beyond your control. The Stoics made a sharp distinction between things that are up to us, our judgments, our desires, our responses to events, and things that are not up to us, other people's actions, natural disasters, the circumstances of our birth, the inevitability of death. Wisdom, for a Stoic, consists in focusing your energy on the first category and releasing your attachment to the second. At first glance, you might think Conquest has something in common with the Stoics. He is, after all, remarkably unperturbed. He does not panic, he does not despair, he faces injury and setback with a calm that borders on indifference. When the Ragnars tore off his arm on the savage planet, when the Scourge virus left him weakened enough that his legendary Viltrumite healing factor could not regenerate the limb, he did not rage against his circumstances. He had a cybernetic prosthetic build, bronze-colored with silver plating and amethyst lights, crafted from an alloy durable enough to match his own immense strength, and he went back to work. That sounds almost stoic, accepting what cannot be changed, adapting, moving forward. But the resemblance is entirely superficial, and understanding why reveals something important about what Stoicism actually is, and what Conquest actually lacks. The Stoics did not advocate for emotional numbness. They did not teach people to stop feeling. They taught people to feel correctly, to align their emotional responses with reason and virtue rather than with appetite and fear. A Stoic does not fail to grieve. A Stoic grieves in proportion to what has been lost, no more and no less, and then channels that grief into virtuous action. A Stoic does not fail to feel pain. A Stoic feels pain and recognizes it as information, as a signal that something requires attention, without allowing it to override their capacity for rational judgment. Conquest does not feel correctly. Conquest barely feels at all. His calm in the face of losing an arm is not Stoic acceptance. It is something closer to the opposite. It is the absence of any framework within which the loss of an arm would carry emotional significance. A Stoic who lost an arm would process the loss, grieve what was taken, find meaning in the adaptation, and use the experience to deepen their understanding of impermanence and resilience. Conquest simply replaced the arm and continued, not because he had achieved some profound acceptance of fate, but because the arm was a tool, and when a tool breaks, you replace it. You do not mourn a hammer. You do not reflect on what the hammer meant to you. You get another hammer. Conquest's relationship to his own body is the same as his relationship to everything else in the universe. Purely instrumental. His body is a vehicle for the Empire's will. When a part fails, you fix it. When it cannot be fixed, you replace it. The body is not him. The cybernetic arm is not him. Nothing is him. There is no him to be. Just function. Just the mission. Just the next planet. This instrumental relationship to his own body raises a philosophical question that the comics handle with surprising subtlety. When Conquest chose to accept the cybernetic prosthetic rather than retire or withdraw from active service, he was making a statement about the relationship between identity and physical wholeness. For most beings, the loss of a limb is a life-altering event. It changes how you move through the world. It changes how others perceive you. It forces a reckoning with vulnerability and limitation that can fundamentally reshape your understanding of who you are. Entire philosophical traditions have emerged from the experience of physical loss, from the Stoics who used illness and injury as opportunities for moral growth, to the existentialists who saw bodily limitation as a confrontation with the absurd. Conquest's response to losing his arm is to negate the loss entirely. The cybernetic replacement restores his function. It allows him to continue doing what he has always done. It closes the wound, not just physically, but existentially. It prevents the loss from becoming an opening, a crack in the armor through which something like self-knowledge might have entered. Think about what his lost arm could have meant if he had let it mean something. It could have been a confrontation with mortality, because even Viltrumites can be permanently damaged. It could have been evidence that the philosophy of strength has limits, that there are creatures in the universe, like the Ragnars, that do not care how strong you are and will tear you apart regardless. It could have been an invitation to reconsider, to slow down, to wonder whether 5,000 years of violence might have been leading somewhere other than where he thought. Instead, the cybernetic arm becomes a monument to denial, a prosthetic not just for the missing limb, but for the missing reflection. It says, nothing has changed. The mission continues. The philosophy holds. The arm was expendable, and so was whatever lesson its loss might have taught. And in a way, the cybernetic arm is the perfect symbol for Conquest as a whole. A mechanical replacement for something organic. A functional substitute for something alive. It works. It does the job. But it is not real. It is not his. It is a technology performing the role that flesh once performed. And the gap between the original and the replacement is the gap between living and merely functioning. There is a dimension to Conquest that becomes clearer when you place him alongside the real-world philosophical traditions that justified empire and colonialism. The doctrine that superior civilizations have a right, even a duty, to subjugate inferior ones did not begin with the Viltrumites. It runs through human history like a scar. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was justified in part by the philosopher Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued in the 1550 Valladolid debate that the indigenous peoples of the New World were natural slaves, beings whose inherent inferiority made them appropriate subjects for domination by their European betters. Sepúlveda drew on Aristotle, selectively and dishonestly, to argue that some beings are born to rule and others are born to be ruled, and that this hierarchy is natural, inevitable, and just. The British Empire justified itself through what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, a phrase that dressed up exploitation in the language of moral obligation. The colonized peoples were not being conquered, the argument went. They were being civilized. They were being lifted from savagery into the light of European culture, education, and governance. The violence was regrettable but necessary. The destruction of indigenous ways of life was painful but progressive. The empire was not taking, it was giving. And if the recipients of this generosity did not appreciate it, well, that was further evidence of their need for guidance. The Viltrumite Empire strips away these pretensions and reveals the machinery underneath. There is no white man's burden in the Viltrum Empire. There is no civilizing mission. There is no pretense of improvement or uplift. The Viltrumites do not claim to be making the galaxy a better place. They claim to be strong. Full stop. The justification is the power itself, and Conquest is the purest expression of this stripped-down imperialism. An imperialism that is dispensed with every rationalization except the original one. We take because we can. We rule because we are able. We destroy because nothing can stop us. It is Thrasymachus again. It is Sepúlveda without the theological window dressing. It is the colonial project reduced to its essential, ugly, unavoidable core. This is why Conquest, despite being a fictional character in a comic book, resonates with something real and uncomfortable, because the philosophy he embodies is not fictional. It is not an invention of Robert Kirkman's imagination. It is the oldest political philosophy in the world. It predates Thrasymachus. It predates written language. It is the philosophy of every being that has ever looked at a weaker being and thought, I can take what you have, and there is nothing you can do about it. It is the philosophy of the schoolyard bully and the colonial governor and the warlord and a tyrant. And its persistence, its refusal to die no matter how many philosophers refute it, tells you something troubling about the world we live in. Thrasymachus lost the argument in the Republic. Socrates defeated him with logic and reason and elegant analogies. But Thrasymachus did not stop being right about how the world actually works. The strong still dominate the weak. Empires still rise and fall on the basis of military power. Justice, in practice, still bends toward those who have the resources to enforce their version of it. Socrates won the argument. Thrasymachus won the world. And Conquest is what winning the world looks like. Not a triumph, not a celebration, not a being enjoying the spoils of victory. Just an old warrior with a mechanical arm standing on another broken planet preparing for the next assignment. This is what the philosophy of strength produces when it succeeds completely. Not happiness, not fulfillment, not even satisfaction in any recognizable sense. Just continuation, just more of the same forever, until something or someone finally stops you. Think about this from a slightly different angle, because there is a paradox embedded in Conquest's existence that is easy to miss and difficult to forget once you see it. The Viltrumite philosophy claims that strength is the only virtue, that the strong deserve to rule, that weakness is the only sin. But Conquest himself, the embodiment of this philosophy, the being who has practiced it more consistently and for longer than any other Viltrumite in existence, is in many ways the weakest character in the entire Invincible series. Not physically. Physically, he is among the most powerful beings in the known universe. But in every other dimension of existence, he is staggeringly, catastrophically weak. He cannot form relationships. He cannot adapt to new circumstances. He cannot conceive of an identity outside the one the Empire gave him. He cannot process loss. He cannot grow. He cannot change. He cannot do any of the things that genuine strength, the kind that sustains you across the long years, actually requires. There is a type of steel that is incredibly hard. It can cut through almost anything. It holds its edge better than any other alloy. But it has a fatal flaw. It is brittle. Apply force in the right direction and it shatters. Not bends, shatters. Because the same molecular structure that makes it hard makes it unable to flex. It cannot absorb impact. It cannot redistribute stress. It can only hold or break, with nothing in between. Conquest is that steel. He is the hardest, sharpest, most dangerous being the Empire has ever produced, and he is completely, irreversibly brittle. He breaks the moment something happens that his philosophy cannot account for. When Eve's love unlocks a power he has no framework for understanding, he does not adapt. He does not recalibrate. He simply continues doing what he has always done, hitting harder, as if the problem were one of insufficient force rather than insufficient comprehension. When Mark refuses to die according to the rules Conquest understands, Conquest does not wonder why. He does not ask what is motivating this stubborn young half-Viltrumite, who will not let go even as his body is being torn apart. He just keeps hitting, because hitting is all he knows. And when hitting is all you know, every problem looks like something that needs to be hit harder. This is why the Stoics, to return to them briefly, would have seen Conquest as a cautionary example rather than a model of strength. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who spent his evenings writing private philosophical reflections that would become one of the most enduring works of Stoic thought, the Meditations, understood something about power that Conquest never learned. Marcus Aurelius had more practical power than almost anyone in the ancient world. He commanded legions. He ruled an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. He could have been the Roman Conquest, a being of absolute authority who used that authority to crush everything in his path. Instead, he spent his evenings writing notes to himself about humility, about the transience of fame, about the importance of treating every person, even enemies, with dignity and reason. The same man who commanded the Roman army against the Germanic tribes wrote that the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. The same emperor who could have ordered the death of anyone in his domain wrote that waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. The difference between Marcus Aurelius and Conquest is not power. They both have it. The difference is what they do with the space that power creates. Power gives you options. It opens doors. It creates the freedom to choose what kind of being you want to be. And what you do with that freedom tells the universe everything about who you are. Marcus Aurelius used his power to create a space for reflection, for growth, for the difficult work of becoming a better version of himself, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Conquest uses his power to close every door except the one marked violence. He has more options than almost any being alive, and he exercises exactly one of them over and over for 5 millennia. The Stoics would say that this is not strength. This is the most profound form of slavery. To be free and not know it. To have the power to choose and never exercise it. To be capable of anything and achieve only one thing. That is not the mark of a warrior. That is the mark of a prisoner who has mistaken his cell for the world. There is something worth exploring about Conquest's obsession that becomes particularly visible during his second appearance in both the comics and the animated series. In the comics, after Mark defeats Conquest in their first fight in issue 65, Conquest is captured and held in a facility under the supervision of Cecil Stedman, the head of the Global Defense Agency. He is injured, he is weakened. By any rational assessment, his mission to Earth has failed. And a being of genuine wisdom would use this period of enforced stillness to reconsider, to ask questions, to wonder whether the failure on Earth might indicate something about the limits of the approach. But Conquest does not reconsider. He recovers his strength, escapes, and immediately seeks out another confrontation with Mark. Not because the Empire orders it, not because strategic necessity demands it, but because the failure itself is intolerable. Because Conquest's identity is so completely fused with his function that a failure of function is a failure of self. And the only way to repair the self is to redo the function, to try again, to win this time. This is what obsession looks like when it is wearing the mask of duty. Conquest tells himself, and possibly believes, that he is pursuing Mark because the Empire requires it, because the mission demands it, because Viltrumite honor is at stake. But the truth that the comics hint at through the intensity of the second fight, is that Conquest is pursuing Mark because Mark is the first thing in possibly centuries that has made Conquest feel alive, not the victory he expects. The challenge itself, the experience of encountering a being who does not break according to schedule, who resists in ways that the program did not predict, who introduces variables that 5,000 years of experience cannot account for. Mark Grayson is, for Conquest, the most interesting thing that has happened in a very long time. And for a being who has been numb for millennia, interest is indistinguishable from need. This dynamic, the predator who becomes obsessed with the prey that escaped, runs through literature and philosophy in ways that illuminate what is really happening inside Conquest. Think about Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, a character who transforms a whale into the symbol of everything he cannot control, everything that defies his will, everything that reminds him of his own limitations. Ahab does not pursue the white whale because it is rational. He pursues it because the whale took something from him. His leg, his certainty, his sense of mastery over the world, and the only way to restore what was taken is to destroy the thing that took it. The pursuit consumes him. It overrides his duty to his crew. It subordinates every other value to the single, burning need to prove that he is bigger than the thing that hurt him. Conquest's pursuit of Mark has the same structure. Mark took something from Conquest, not his arm, the Ragnars did that, but something more precious. His record, his certainty, his 5,000-year streak of never failing, of never encountering a problem that could not be solved through the application of sufficient violence. Mark broke the pattern, and for a being whose entire identity is the pattern, whose entire existence is defined by the unbroken repetition of conquest after conquest, that break is an existential wound far deeper than any physical injury. The cybernetic arm can replace a lost limb. Nothing can replace a lost certainty. And so Conquest pursues Mark the way Ahab pursues the whale, not for the empire, not for duty, not for honor, but for the desperate, unacknowledged need to close the wound, to prove that the philosophy still holds, to demonstrate one more time that strength really is the only virtue. The tragedy, of course, is that the pursuit itself disproves the thesis. If strength were really the only virtue, Conquest would not need to prove it. He would not need to chase down a half-Viltrumite teenager and beat the lesson into him. The very fact that Mark's survival threatens Conquest's worldview is evidence that the worldview is fragile, that it depends not on its own truth, but on the absence of counterexamples. One failure, one young man who refuses to stay down, one crack in the 5,000-year facade, and the whole thing trembles. That is not the mark of a strong philosophy. That is the mark of a brittle one. And brittleness, as we have already established, is exactly what the Viltrumite philosophy produces. Consider what Conquest's death actually means within the philosophical framework we have been building. He dies in the vacuum of space, suffocated by Mark Grayson, a being he considered his inferior in every measurable way. The manner of his death is itself a philosophical statement. He is not defeated by a greater force. He is not outmaneuvered by a superior strategist. He is not overwhelmed by technology or magic or any external advantage. He is killed by a boy who grabbed him and refused to let go. The most primitive possible technique. The strategy of a creature with no other options. And it works. It works because Conquest, for all his 5,000 years of refined combat technique, has no answer for someone who has already accepted death. His entire martial philosophy is built on the assumption that his opponent wants to live. That survival instinct can be exploited, that pain will produce retreat, that the body's desire to continue existing will eventually override the mind's commitment to the fight. And for 5,000 years, that assumption held. Every opponent he faced eventually flinched, eventually broke, eventually chose survival over resistance. Mark does not flinch. Mark does not break. Mark does not choose survival. He chooses something that Conquest literally cannot comprehend, a value that supersedes his own life. And in that choice, Mark reveals the deepest flaw in the Viltrumite philosophy. Might does not make right. Might makes might, and when you encounter someone for whom rightness matters more than survival, your might becomes irrelevant. Not insufficient, irrelevant, because you and your opponent are no longer playing the same game. You are playing a game of strength, and they are playing a game of meaning. And in a contest between those two games, meaning wins. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, not without terrible cost. But in the end, the being who is fighting for something outlasts the being who is fighting for nothing. Because nothing, no matter how forcefully it is pursued, is still nothing. Conquest dies not understanding this. That is perhaps the most important thing about his death. He does not have a moment of revelation. He does not look into Mark's eyes and finally see the thing he has been missing for 5,000 years. He does not experience the kind of deathbed conversion that fiction loves to give its villains, the last-second redemption that retroactively makes the suffering meaningful. He dies confused. He dies processing a tactical failure, trying to understand why his techniques are not working, why the boy will not let go, why the expected outcome is not materializing. He dies the way he lived, inside the philosophy, enclosed by it, defined by it, unable even at the very end to see past the walls of the cage he built for himself. And there is something unbearably sad about that, if you let yourself feel it. 5,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history, longer than the pyramids have been standing, longer than any human mind can truly comprehend. And at the end of all those years, no wisdom, no insight, no understanding that was not there at the beginning. Just an old warrior dying in the dark between the stars, still trying to solve the problem with his fists, still unable to imagine that the problem might not be a problem at all, but an invitation to stop, to rest, to be something other than what you were told to be. Conquest never accepted that invitation. He never even heard it being offered, and so he died as the Viltrumite philosophy's most faithful servant and its most devastating critique, a being who proved, through the simple fact of his empty, violent, interminable existence, that strength without meaning is not strength at all. It is just force. And force, as Simone Weil knew, turns everything it touches into a thing, including the one who wields it. Let me take you to one more place before we begin to close this out, because there is an aspect of Conquest that does not get discussed enough, and it has to do with the nature of identity itself. When you have lived for 5,000 years, who are you? Not in the philosophical sense, though that question applies too. In the practical sense. What is the thread of continuity that connects the being Conquest was 5,000 years ago to the being he is when he arrives on Earth? Human beings change constantly. The cells in your body are replaced every 7 to 10 years. Your personality shifts, your values evolve. The person you are at 40 is in many measurable ways a different person than the one you were at 20. We accept a kind of useful fiction that we are the same person across time because the changes are gradual and the narrative is continuous. But it is a fiction. The self is not a fixed thing. It is a process, a river, not a stone. Now stretch that across 5 millennia. What is left of the original Conquest? What memories survive from his earliest centuries? What has he forgotten? What has been overwritten by the sheer volume of experience accumulated over thousands of years? Is there a young Viltrumite somewhere inside that ancient body who once looked up at the stars and felt wonder, instead of the calculation of a military strategist assessing potential targets? Is there a version of Conquest from before the Great Purge who might have been something other than what he became? We do not know. The comics do not tell us, and that silence, again, is the point. Whatever Conquest might have been has been so thoroughly overwritten by what the Empire made him that it no longer exists even as a memory. He is not a person who became a weapon. He is a weapon who may once have been a person, and the difference between those two things is the distance between tragedy and mere brutality. The philosopher Derek Parfit wrote extensively about personal identity and the question of what makes a person the same person over time. Parfit argued that there is no deep fact about personal identity. There is no soul, no essential self, no unchanging core that persists through time and makes you you. What exists instead is a chain of psychological connections, memories, beliefs, desires, personality traits that link your present self to your past self. And these connections can be strong or weak. The connection between who you are today and who you were yesterday is very strong. The connection between who you are today and who you were 30 years ago is weaker. The connection between who you are today and who you will be in 1,000 years, if you could live that long, might be non-existent. By Parfit's reasoning, Conquest is not one person. He is a succession of persons, each connected to the next by gradually weakening chains of psychological continuity, until the being who exists now has no meaningful connection to the being who existed 5,000 years ago. They share a body. They share a name, they share a reputation, but they do not share an identity in any psychologically meaningful sense. The being who stands over Mark Grayson's broken body is not the same being who was born during the reign of Emperor Argal. He is a descendant, a copy of a copy of a copy, each generation slightly degraded, slightly simplified, slightly more reduced to the single function that the Empire demands. What you see when you look at Conquest is not a person who has lived for 5,000 years. It is the residue of 5,000 years of living, the sediment, the part that survived because the Empire found it useful and everything else was gradually worn away. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Viltrumite philosophy. It does not just use people, it erases them. It takes beings of extraordinary potential and grinds them down to their most useful function, not through external force alone, though force is certainly part of it, but through culture, through the slow, patient work of telling someone century after century that their value lies in their strength and their strength alone. That everything else about them, their curiosity, their capacity for joy, their desire for connection, their creative impulses, their fear, their wonder, their love, is weakness, is a liability, is something to be eliminated. And if you hear that message long enough, from enough sources, In enough variations, eventually you stop being able to hear anything else. Eventually, the other parts of you go quiet. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were starved. Conquest is a being who has been starved of everything except violence for 5,000 years. And what you see, when you look at him, is the result. A being of incredible physical capability and almost total internal poverty. A being who can shatter a planet but cannot hold a conversation that is not about shattering planets. A being who is feared across the galaxy but known by no one. Not really. Not in the way that knowing another person requires seeing them, understanding them, caring about what they feel and what they need. No one knows Conquest. And Conquest knows no one. He has been too busy conquering to stop and introduce himself. This is the quiet horror at the center of the character. Not the violence he inflicts, though that violence is horrific. Not the worlds he has broken, though those worlds are countless. The quiet horror is the 5,000 years of solitary confinement that he does not even know he is serving. The prison he carries with him. Not in the form of walls and bars, but in the form of a philosophy that has convinced him that the prison is actually a palace, that the emptiness is actually strength. There is a thought experiment in philosophy known as the ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank of a ship, one at a time, until none of the original planks remain, is it still the same ship? The question is about identity and change, about what makes something itself over time. Apply this to Conquest. Over 5,000 years, every cell in his body has been replaced countless times. Every neural pathway has been rewritten. Every memory has been encoded and re-encoded and modified by subsequent experience. The being who exists today shares no physical material with the being who was born 5 millennia ago. He is, in a very real sense, a completely different entity inhabiting the same narrative. And the narrative the story the Empire tells about who Conquest is the only thing that provides continuity. Without that narrative, without the role of enforcer and destroyer, there is no thread connecting the ancient past to the present. The role is the ship. Remove it, and there is nothing left. No planks, no vessel, no Conquest. Just a 5,000-year-old body with no story to tell about itself. This raises an uncomfortable question about all of us, not just fictional Viltrumite warriors. How much of who you are is really you, and how much is the role you have been assigned? The stories your family tells about you, the expectations your culture places on you, the narrative your career provides for your life. Strip all of that away, and what remains? For most people, the answer is something. Some irreducible core of preference and personality that would persist even in the absence of social context. But for Conquest, the answer appears to be nothing. The role is all there is. The mask has fused with the face beneath it. There is no Conquest without Conquest. The noun and the verb have become indistinguishable. Here is something else worth considering as you settle deeper into wherever you are right now. The Viltrumite scourge virus, the genetically engineered pathogen that nearly wiped out the species, is itself a kind of philosophical argument. A virus that targets Viltrumites specifically, that exploits their biology against them, that proves that even the strongest beings in the universe have vulnerabilities they cannot punch their way through. The scourge virus reduced the Viltrumite population to fewer than 50 individuals. Fewer than 50, out of a species that once numbered in the millions or possibly billions. And Conquest survived it. He survives everything. But the virus left its mark. It weakened him enough that when the Ragnars attacked on the savage planet, his legendary Viltrumite healing factor could not restore his arm, could not fix his eye. The scars he carries are permanent reminders that even the Viltrumite philosophy of strength has limits, that there are forces in the universe that do not care how strong you are. The lost arm is particularly symbolic. In literature, the loss of a limb often represents a loss of wholeness, a physical manifestation of something that has been taken from the character on a deeper level. Think of Captain Ahab's leg, consumed by the white whale that becomes his obsession. Think of Luke Skywalker's hand, severed by the father whose dark legacy he must confront. Conquest's missing arm, replaced by a cybernetic prosthetic, suggests the same kind of symbolic loss. Something was taken from him, not just on the savage planet, but long before that. Perhaps during the Great Purge, perhaps during his first mission as the Empire's enforcer, perhaps on the day he decided, or the day it was decided for him, that strength was the only thing worth being. The prosthetic arm is functional. It works. It might even be more efficient than the original, but it is not his. It is a replacement, a substitute, a piece of technology doing the job that living flesh once did. And that substitution, that replacement of the organic with the mechanical, of the living with the merely functional, is the story of Conquest's entire existence in miniature. And now, here at the end, let us return to where we began. An old Viltrumite stands over a broken young man. His one remaining arm hangs at his side. His face, scarred by 5 millennia of combat, shows nothing that could be called emotion. Not satisfaction, not anger, not even the cold satisfaction of a job well done, because the job is not well done. The young man is still breathing. The planet is not yet conquered. There is still work to be done. And Conquest, as he has done for 5,000 years, as he will do until someone finally stops him, turns his attention to the next task. Not because he wants to, not because he chooses to, but because that is what the philosophy of Conquest requires. An eternal present tense, an infinite series of problems to be solved through force. A lifetime, many lifetimes, spent in the service of an idea that consumes everything it touches, including the one who carries it. Mark Grayson eventually stops him, a young man who is weaker, less experienced, and less skilled, but who carries inside himself something that 5,000 years of Viltrumite optimization could not produce. A reason beyond the mission, beyond the Empire, beyond the philosophy of strength. A reason that is small and personal and, by Viltrumite standards, embarrassingly weak. He wants to go home. He wants to see Eve. He wants to live in a world where strength is not the only thing that matters. And that small, weak personal reason turns out to be enough. Enough to hold on when his body is being torn apart. Enough to maintain his grip when Conquest's prosthetic arm pushes against his throat. Enough to keep squeezing when every rational calculation says he should let go. Conquest dies in the vacuum of space, suffocated by a being he considered inferior. And in his final moments, if there are final moments for a being like Conquest, if the 5,000 years allow for one last flicker of something resembling awareness, perhaps he understands. Perhaps in the instant before the light goes out, he sees what the philosophy cost him, what it took, what it replaced. Perhaps he sees the young man who is killing him and recognizes for the first time what it looks like when someone fights for something real. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Perhaps 5,000 years of the Viltrumite philosophy is enough to extinguish even the possibility of that kind of insight. Perhaps Conquest dies exactly as he lived, empty, effective, and entirely alone. That is the philosophy of Conquest. Not a set of ideas to be debated, but a way of existing to be examined. Not a villain to be defeated, but a mirror to be confronted. Because the questions Conquest raises are not questions about Viltrumites or comic books or fictional empires. They are questions about you, about what you optimize for, about what you sacrifice in the name of strength or success or efficiency, about whether the life you are building piece by piece, day by day, is one that will sustain you across the years or one that will slowly hollow you out until there is nothing left but function. Conquest never asked himself these questions. He did not know they existed, but and that knowledge, that simple awareness that there is more to existence than Conquest, is perhaps the most powerful thing in the universe. More powerful than a Viltrumite fist. More powerful than 5,000 years of experience. More powerful than the philosophy that built an empire and destroyed every soul that served it. And if that thought is the last one you carry into sleep tonight, then perhaps this long conversation has been worth having, not because it solved anything. Not because the philosophy of Conquest has been defeated by 2.5 hours of quiet analysis, but because you are still awake enough to hear it, still curious enough to think about it, still connected enough to the world, to the people you love, to the person you are becoming to care about what a fictional old warrior with one arm tells you about the meaning of strength. That caring is your answer. That caring is the thing the Viltrumites killed and the thing Mark Grayson refused to let die. Hold on to it. And if you are falling asleep right now, let it follow you into your dreams. And if you made it all the way here, whether your eyes are closing or you are still thinking it over, consider subscribing. It is completely free and it helps us keep making these long, quiet explorations for you. Good night.